She was declared dead at 6, buried under a small stone, forgotten by the world. 5 years later, both pilots collapsed mid-flight and a child took the controls. When she spoke her mother's call sign over the radio, F-22 pilots froze in shock. That name was Ghost Rider. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Mila Reyes was declared dead at 6, after a small plane went down in the mountains of Idaho and no rescue team could find a body in the wreck. Her mother, Captain Elena Reyes, was flying that plane. Elena Reyes was a fighter pilot who once flew the F-22 Raptor for the United States Air Force, and her call sign among the other pilots was Ghost Rider. The crash was ruled an accident, the case was closed, and a small stone with Mila's name on it was placed beside her mother's in a quiet cemetery outside Boise. But Mila did not die that day. A retired flight engineer named Walter Hale found her 3 miles from the crash site, cold, silent, and barely breathing, with a broken arm and no memory of how she got there. Walter never called the authorities. He had flown cargo planes for 25 years and he had also flown missions with Elena Reyes long before either of them left the service. He looked at that little girl and made a choice that would shape both their lives for the next 5 years. He told no one she was alive. He raised her under a new name, in a small house near an old airfield in Montana, far from reporters and far from anyone who might ask questions about a girl who was supposed to be in a grave. Walter did not raise her like a normal child. Every evening after homework, he took her out to the barn behind the house, where he had built a cockpit mock-up from parts of a retired training aircraft. He taught her the names of every switch, every gauge, every warning light. He taught her how an engine breathes, how wings create lift, how a pilot reads the sky before the sky turns against her. Mila never asked why a girl her age needed to know these things. She only knew that when she sat in that mock-up cockpit, she felt closer to a mother she barely remembered, a woman she had only seen in one photograph, standing tall in a flight suit with a confident smile and the sky behind her. Walter told her, again and again, that her mother was the best pilot he had ever known, and that being her daughter did not mean hiding forever. It meant being ready, in case the day ever came when readiness mattered more than safety. Mila grew up quiet and careful, the way children become when they carry a secret too heavy for their age. At school under her new name, she was just another shy kid who liked airplanes a little too much. She kept to herself at recess, drawing wings and engines in the corner of her notebook while other children played games she never quite understood how to join. Teachers described her as polite but distant, a girl who did her homework early and never raised her hand unless she was certain of the answer. None of them knew that her real education happened after the school bus dropped her off, behind the old farmhouse, inside a barn that smelled of oil and dust and old leather seats. At home, she was something else entirely. Walter would walk her through failures on purpose, cutting power to a simulated engine mid-flight, flooding a gauge with false readings, forcing her to diagnose a problem before it became a disaster. In the beginning she froze during these drills, her hands hovering uselessly over switches she barely understood. Walter never raised his voice when she made a mistake. He simply reset the drill and made her run it again, and again, until her hands stopped shaking and her mind started working faster than her fear. By the time she was 10, she could recite checklists from memory, calling out each step in a flat, steady voice that made Walter smile quietly to himself. By 11, she understood autopilot systems, fuel management, and basic weather patterns better than most student pilots twice her age, though she had never once touched the controls of a real aircraft. Walter never explained exactly why he pushed her so hard, until the year his cough would not go away and the doctors told him the truth. He sat her down in the barn, next to the old mock-up cockpit, and told her everything. He told her that her mother's crash had never fully made sense to him, that parts of the wreckage suggested a fuel system failure that should not have happened on a plane that knew. He told her he had never reported it because he feared what it might mean if the wrong people learned that Ghost Rider had a daughter who survived. He told her he was dying, and that soon she would have to step back into the world under her real name, because there was no one left to hide her. Walter passed away 2 months later. His will named a distant cousin as executor, a quiet lawyer named Priya Anand, who uncovered the truth buried in Walter's private papers. Birth records, old photographs, a letter Walter had written years earlier explaining exactly who Mila was and why he had done what he did. The legal process to bring a girl back from the dead was slow and strange, but eventually it was done. Mila Reyes, once buried under a small stone in Boise, was alive again on paper. Priya arranged for her to travel to Washington, D.C., to attend a memorial gathering for pilots who had served alongside her mother, carrying with her a small urn of Walter's ashes, because he had asked to be remembered among people who understood the sky the way he did. She sat in seat 22C on a wide passenger jet, a quiet 11-year-old girl surrounded by strangers who had no idea what she carried inside her, both the ashes in her bag and the training in her mind. The flight took off from Montana under a clear afternoon sky, climbing smoothly toward cruising altitude, engines humming with the steady rhythm of a routine flight. Passengers read books, watched movies, and drifted off to sleep, unaware that anything unusual was happening at all. Mila watched the wing outside her window and quietly touched the glass, the way Walter always did before takeoff, a small habit passed down from a mother she never truly knew. 40 minutes into the flight, somewhere over the plains, both pilots in the cockpit began to feel the same strange symptoms at almost the same time. A cracked seal in the pressurization system had allowed engine fumes to slowly seep into the air supply, filling the cockpit with an invisible gas that no one could smell or see. The captain felt his vision blur first, then a heavy fog settling over his thoughts. He tried to warn his first officer, but his words came out slurred and broken. Within a minute, both pilots slumped forward, unconscious, while the autopilot kept the plane flying straight and steady, unaware that the two people meant to control it could no longer respond to anything. A flight attendant noticed the cockpit alert light blinking on her panel, the signal pilots use when something is deeply wrong. She knocked, entered the code, and opened the door to find both pilots slumped and unresponsive. Her training told her exactly what to do next, even as her hands shook. She called for help over the intercom, alerted the rest of the crew, and gave the order that no flight attendant ever wants to give. Passengers who had been half asleep sat up straight as the announcement came through the cabin speakers, asking if anyone on board had any flying experience at all. The calm cabin turned into a storm of fear within seconds. People gripped armrests, whispered prayers, and reached for their phones with shaking hands, trying to call the people they loved most. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, searching for anyone who might help. A man who once flew small planes for fun said he had not touched a control panel in 15 years. A woman who worked at an airport ticket counter admitted she knew nothing about actually flying a plane. No one on that entire aircraft had the training needed to bring nearly 200 people home safely. In seat 22C, Mila sat frozen for a moment, her mind racing through everything Walter had ever taught her, every checklist, every emergency drill, every quiet evening in that barn. She thought of her mother's photograph, of the woman who once flew for a living and never once hesitated when lives were on the line. She thought of Walter's final words in the barn, telling her that readiness mattered more than fear. She unbuckled her seatbelt and walked toward the front of the cabin, small and steady among the panic around her. A flight attendant tried to stop her gently, telling her to sit back down, that this was not the time for a child to be wandering the aisle. Mila looked up and said quietly that she could fly the plane, that she had been trained for exactly this kind of emergency. The flight attendant stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or cry, but something in the girl's calm voice made her hesitate instead of dismissing her outright. With no other option left, and time slipping away with every passing second, the crew made the only choice they had. They brought Mila into the cockpit. Inside, the space felt both familiar and impossibly real at the same time. She had studied cockpits like this in books and diagrams for years, but sitting in the actual seat, surrounded by real instruments showing real numbers, was nothing like the barn back home. The dials were brighter, the switches heavier under her fingers, the hum of the engines louder and more alive than any recording Walter had ever played for her. For one long second, her mind went completely blank, and she was certain she had made a terrible mistake by walking into that cockpit at all. Then she remembered Walter's voice from 100 drills, telling her that fear was allowed as long as it did not stop her hands from moving. The two unconscious pilots were moved gently to the cabin, where passengers with basic medical knowledge began checking their pulses and administering oxygen. Mila climbed into the captain's seat, her feet barely reaching the pedals even with the seat pushed forward as far as it would go. A flight attendant found a spare cushion and tucked it behind her back so she could see clearly over the instrument panel. Mila scanned the instruments the way Walter had taught her, checking altitude, airspeed, fuel levels, and autopilot status, her small hands moving with a precision that did not match her age at all. Behind her, the flight attendant who had brought her into the cockpit stood frozen, watching a child work through a checklist with the same calm focus of a professional twice her size, unable to decide whether what she was witnessing was terrifying or miraculous. She found the radio and pressed the transmit switch, taking a breath before speaking the words that would change everything. She declared an emergency, explained that both pilots were unconscious, and stated clearly that she was now in control of the aircraft. Air traffic control asked immediately who was speaking and what kind of experience they had. Mila paused for only a second before answering with the truth her guardian had given his life preparing her to speak. She said her mother had flown fighter jets for the Air Force, that her mother's call sign had been Ghost Rider, and that she herself had been trained in secret for 5 years by a man who had once flown missions beside her mother. The controller asked her to repeat the name, certain he had misheard something impossible. Nearby, on a routine patrol far above the clouds, 2 military jets caught the transmission on a shared frequency. The lead pilot's voice came through sharp with disbelief, asking dispatch to confirm what had just been said. When the answer came back, confirming the words exactly, F-22 pilots froze in their cockpits for a long moment, staring at their instruments as if the sky itself had spoken to them. One of the 2 pilots had flown beside Elena Reyes years earlier and remembered her call sign the way soldiers remember the names of the fallen, with respect too heavy for casual conversation. He keyed his radio immediately and asked for the girl's name, his voice suddenly unsteady in a way that surprised even himself. Mila answered clearly despite her racing heart, giving her full name and confirming that Elena Reyes had died saving her from a crash in the mountains. She was declared dead at 6, she said, and 5 years later she was still alive, sitting in a cockpit because there was no one else who could fly the plane. The pilot on the radio told her he remembered her as a small child, that he had once brought her a toy plane during a visit to her mother's squadron, and that he could not believe the little girl he remembered was now speaking to him from the cockpit of a commercial jet in the middle of an emergency. He told her to stay calm, that he and his wingmen were diverting immediately to guide her safely to the ground, and that he would walk her through every single step. The 2 fighter jets adjusted course and climbed to intercept the airliner, arriving within minutes to fly alongside the much larger aircraft in a tight, steady formation. Through the cockpit window, Mila could see them clearly, sleek gray shapes holding position just off her wing, a sight so strange and beautiful that for a moment her fear softened into something closer to wonder. The lead pilot's voice remained in her ear the entire time, calm and patient, walking her through altitude checks, speed control, and the slow, careful descent toward the nearest airport with a runway long enough for a plane that size. He reminded her to trust the training that Walter had given her, telling her that a good teacher builds a pilot's instincts long before that pilot ever needs them. As the aircraft descended through the clouds, the ground crew below prepared for the worst while hoping quietly for the best. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, their lights flashing in the fading afternoon sun. Inside the cockpit, Mila's hands trembled slightly on the controls, but her voice on the radio stayed steady, repeating back every instruction the pilot gave her before she acted on it, exactly the way Walter had drilled into her during their long evenings in the barn. "Confirm before you move," he used to say, because a fast mistake is worse than a slow correct answer. She followed that rule now, altitude by altitude, mile by mile, letting the calm voice in her headset carry her closer to the ground. Mila followed every instruction with a focus that surprised even herself, adjusting speed, lowering the landing gear, extending the flaps step by step exactly as she had practiced 1,000 times in a barn far from any real airport. 3 green lights lit up on the panel, confirming the landing gear was down and locked, and she reported it back exactly the way she had been taught, her voice small but clear over the radio. The pilot guiding her told her she was doing everything right, that her instincts were sharp, that whoever had trained her had done a remarkable job preparing her for a moment neither of them had ever expected to come. The final approach felt endless, the runway growing slowly larger through the windshield, every second stretching longer than the one before it. She could see the emergency vehicles now, tiny shapes lined up along the edges of the runway, waiting for an outcome no one could predict. When the wheels finally touched the ground, the impact was firm but controlled, and the aircraft rolled to a stop safely among the waiting emergency vehicles, engines slowing, alarms silencing, nearly 200 passengers alive because a girl the world had forgotten was even breathing had remembered everything she was taught. For a moment, no one in the cockpit moved or spoke. Then the flight attendant behind her let out a breath she had been holding since the moment she first saw the two pilots slumped in their seats, and somewhere in the cabin behind them, passengers began to cry and laugh and hold each other, understanding slowly that they were going to see their families again. The cabin erupted into stunned, tearful relief. Passengers hugged strangers, called their families, and thanked a crew that had done everything right under impossible pressure. When Mila stepped out of the cockpit, legs shaking from adrenaline, she found flight attendants and passengers alike staring at her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude too large for words. Word of what happened spread quickly, first through emergency channels, then through news reports that struggled to explain how an 11-year-old girl, one the record still listed as deceased, had just landed a passenger jet with the guidance of 2 military pilots and a lifetime of secret training. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the full story, verifying Walter's private records, confirming Mila's identity through medical testing, and finally correcting a death certificate that should never have existed in the first place. The lead pilot who had guided her down, a man who had once called her mother his wingman, made sure he stayed close through every step of that process, unwilling to let Ghost Rider's daughter face the world alone a second time. He and his family eventually became her guardians, giving her the steady home Walter had always wanted for her but never had the time left to build himself. Weeks later, Mila stood at a quiet memorial where her mother's name was carved into stone, holding the small urn that had once belonged to Walter. Around her stood a small group of pilots who had once flown beside Elena Reyes, men and women who had heard the story spreading through their community and wanted to be there when the ashes of the man who had kept her alive were finally laid to rest. The lead pilot who had guided Mila down through the clouds stood closest to her, still in his flight uniform, his eyes red from a grief he had carried quietly for years and only now allowed himself to fully feel. She scattered Walter's ashes gently near the base of the memorial, thanking him softly for every evening spent in that cold barn, for every lesson she once thought she would never need. She touched her mother's engraved name and told her, in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, that she had finally understood why Walter taught her everything he knew, and that she hoped she had made both of them proud. The pilot beside her placed a hand gently on her shoulder and told her that her mother had always wanted her to know the sky, not out of fear, but out of love, and that everything Walter had built in that barn had simply carried that love forward when Elena Reyes no longer could. In the months that followed, Mila settled into a new life with her mother's old friend and his family, a home filled with noise and warmth after 5 quiet years behind a farmhouse. She was still just a child, still learning ordinary things like how to make friends and how to sit through a normal school day without hiding what she knew. But sometimes, in the evenings, the pilot who had become her guardian would take her out to a small airfield nearby, and together they would sit in the cockpit of a simple training plane, going through checklists slowly, patiently, building skills the right way this time instead of out of desperation. She was no longer simply a name on a stone or a secret kept in a farmhouse. She was alive, she was known, and she was ready to carry a legacy that had once belonged only to the sky.